In his book, Consuming History, Jerome de Groot discusses the various ways that history can be used in popular culture, and he explores the many ways that history has been used on the stage. While a piece like Les Mis appears as a period piece, it is fundamentally a modern adaptation of the Victor Hugo novel, which adopts the form of a musical. In illustrating the complex relationship between the past and the stage, de Groot points to Arthur Miller's The Crucible, which adopts the aesthetic of the Salem witch trials in order to criticize the social paranoia created by McCarthy's anti-communist policies. Some plays can have a complex relationship with the very idea of history. Alan Bennett's The History Boys has discussions on the technique of history and its methodology woven throughout it. As you may have guessed from the title and the thumbnail of this video, all of this is leading me to Hamilton, an American musical, the 2015 adaptation of The Life and Times of Alexander Hamilton by Lin-Manuel Miranda. With Hamilton gaining a slight resurgence due to its release on Disney+, I thought now would be a great time to discuss how the musical uses history. I'm going to touch upon ideas de Groot has set up for us, Hamilton as a piece directed at modern times, and Hamilton as a piece that discusses history. Hamilton can also be seen as more than just an adaptation of the past, but also an adaptation of one telling of it, as Lin-Manuel Miranda was inspired by Ron Chernow's biography of Alexander Hamilton. I also want to move slightly beyond that and discuss the idea of ethics, if Hamilton is responsible in how it uses history and the narrative it's chosen to present. Ultimately, I don't believe that Hamilton is very revolutionary in its narrative, despite all its protests otherwise. But whether that truly condemns it as a piece of historical media, I'll leave it up to you. Right, let's get into it. So to be clear, I'm not going to try and nitpick the show. No, it's not historically accurate, but that, in and of itself, isn't an issue. It's primarily a piece of entertainment, not an educational tool. At times it jumbles the order of events, such as the election of 1800. In the musical, the order of events is the death of Hamilton's son, Philip, which leads to Hamilton's withdrawal from public life and the repair of his relationship with his wife, Eliza, which broke down after his affair. It is in that time that the presidential election of 1800 happens, and Hamilton returns to public view to endorse Jefferson, leading to his victory. In retaliation for the slight against him, Burr challenges Hamilton to a duel, where he is shot and killed. This works as a very nice, clean narrative. Snubbing Burr for president is very much the greatest slight he could achieve, so Hamilton's death following this makes sense. But in reality, Philip didn't die until 1801, and Burr challenged Hamilton to the duel in 1804, sparked by insults at a party and another minor election. These changes are not insignificant, but they aren't an issue. By rearranging the timeline, more weight can be given to the character arcs within the story, and thus the narrative is more satisfying. Real life rarely makes such perfect stories, and so any historical entertainment may find itself having to make such changes, and there's no issue with that. The problem comes when entertainment seeks to manipulate our view of the past in ways that are potentially harmful to the present. For all its historical aesthetic, Hamilton is a show that is deeply modern. Part of the motivation for casting people of colour in almost every role was about reinserting people of colour into the American story and presenting them as holding a right to the history as much as white America. The line, "Immigrants, we get the jobs done," resonated so powerfully at the time the musical premiered, largely because it came in stark contrast to the prevailing political attitudes of the time, which very much coalesced in America's current president. These are certainly part of the message of Hamilton, but its strongest message, I would argue, is that through a character study of Alexander Hamilton himself, we can fix the problems of contemporary politics. Lin-Manuel Miranda himself feels that every character of the musical is treated as a person and given their strengths and faults in equal measure, but it's hard to argue that about Hamilton himself. He's disloyal to his wife, but even that gets redeemed by the end, even if it takes his son's death to find that redemption. But as the title character, he remains heroic throughout, from war hero to tireless lawyer who's non-stop, to politician who always fights what he believes in and struggles to compromise his ideals. His enemy throughout his life is Aaron Burr, who stands in as the perfect encapsulation of the modern politician, embodying the main characteristics people hate about the political mainstream. Lin admits that Burr is a Rorschach test. People always assign him to their own political enemies. His catchphrase of "talk less, smile more" sums up the idea that politicians don't really stand up for their own beliefs, but instead do as little as meaningfully possible and then try and look nice when they're up for re-election. Whenever Burr tries to gain any power, Hamilton is always quick to point out that Burr stands for nothing. They don't need to know me, they don't like you. This is in sharp contrast to another of Hamilton's enemies, Jefferson, who clashes with Hamilton over specifics of their government policy, not a simple difference of personality. This central argument, then, is deeply liberal. liberal in the correct usage of the phrase as a political ideology, not in the American usage where it means anything left of the Republicans. The message of the musical is that all our modern problems stem from the flawed individuals. Whichever politicians you see as Burr are the problem, but the system within which they operate are flawless. Serious issues to American democracy, such as the Electoral College or the disenfranchisement of black and other minority voters, well, these are fixed by having a few honest politicians, Hamilton seems to say to us. Now, in isolation, I wouldn't disagree with this argument. Yes, it would be nice if politicians were all honest people who truly cared about change. I think those who wish to hold power should be held to a higher standard than the average person on the street. But even if every politician was an honest person, it wouldn't fix the deep-rooted issues in our societies. Hamilton's liberal ideals are deeply rooted in the text at both a textual and meta level. At the meta level are its comments on modern politicians, and textually are its inability to properly address the biggest structural issue at the time of the American Revolution: slavery. Most people by this point are aware of one of the biggest criticisms of the show, that it presents Alexander Hamilton as a staunch abolitionist.
Bunch of revolutionary manumission abolitionists.
It's not as bad as it could have been. Lynn admitted that at one point he'd written a third cabinet battle, which was about slavery, but realised that since none of those involved did anything to really stop slavery, it fell a bit flat. But it's still rich having Alexander Hamilton use slavery as a political football to dunk on Jefferson in the first cabinet battle. Hamilton never really did anything to stop slavery. Even if he wrote against it, he helped out in the purchasing of slaves for his family, the Schuylers. It's possible he even purchased slaves for himself. Calling Hamilton an abolitionist for writing against it is the same as people who defend Jefferson because he called slavery a hideous blot. It's a belief that what these people said somehow holds more weight than their actual actions. They actively profited from a system of exploitation and rarely did anything meaningful against it unless it had no adverse effects on their wealth. George Washington was, at best, a manumissionist. He freed his slaves upon his death, which was the very bare minimum of anti-slavery actions a slaver could take. He still profited of black people's suffering until his death, but at least he made some material change. It's a very low bar, though, when others like Jefferson didn't even free slaves they had numerous children by. The musical shows these men as being in some way helpless actors in the current of history, but they were the ones holding the power. Hamilton is a compelling point of view character because he did genuinely come from a family without any great wealth. But in the second act of the musical, he is wealthy and holds a key position within government. The original version of One Last Time, One Last Ride, was about Hamilton and Washington putting down the Whiskey Rebellion. It was cut, which is a shame because it highlights how even though you can view the American revolutionaries as fighting a greater power, they ultimately became that same power. However, even that statement feels like a bit of an oversimplification of the matter, which kind of highlights the point I'm getting onto. Hamilton refuses to place its events within adequate context. By limiting its view, it recreates a traditional nationalist narrative of the American foundation. The American Revolution can't be said to be a populist revolution. It was led by the landowners, the slave owners, who wanted more power which the British Empire didn't give them. Howard Zinn's The People's History of the United States is very illuminating on how those in power effectively hoodwinked the common people to fight for economic interests that weren't their own. One line in the musical stands out to me a lot. Why should a tiny island across the sea regulate the price of tea? The musical would seem to buy hook, line and sinker the idea that Britain was an oppressive economic force, stealing wealth from America. No taxation without representation. But there was no representation for most people after the Revolution, most importantly slaves who were worse than taxed by having any wealth they worked to build denied to them, and those who opposed taxation were violently put down, as in the case of the Whiskey Rebellion. I'm not defending the British Empire here. The British Parliament was an undemocratic sham. But the American experiment didn't offer sudden representation to everyone. This rather nicely leads us on to those who weren't even mentioned in passing by the musical: Native Americans. One of the most important reasons for the revolution was the desire to continue the expansion west. Following the so-called French Indian War, the British forbid the continued expansion and installed a standing army to police the border of native territory, with the intent to stop colonists settling there. Now, I don't want to give the impression that the British did this out of any altruism. It was financially motivated. They didn't want more conflict with France or with the natives, and they didn't see any point to investing in America and getting more land there. The American mainland colonies were nowhere near as profitable to the empire as the Caribbean colonies. Of course, to pay for this border force, the British needed money, and they felt it right to extract that cost from the colonies themselves. I want to be clear here that I'm trying to present this neutrally. I don't have a view as to whether the taxes were right, but I don't think it matters. Big landowners like Washington were invested in expanding their lands, and the Revolution was a means to an end of that, at the cost of the Native Americans. Counterfactual history is of little value to me. It's impossible to know if the expansion was inevitable once colonisation had begun, or if the British really would have never bothered to try and steal any more native land. But to dress up the American revolutionaries as the scrappy underdogs to a colonial power, when they themselves were acting with colonial interests, is buying into the same myths as so much of American pop culture. It's not a revolutionary way to tell the revolutionary story. Maybe in that way the tagline, an American musical, is very apt indeed. Now, Lin-Manuel Miranda is insistent that every character gets criticised fairly, but controversially I know, I would argue they don't. Hamilton certainly doesn't. Yes, his extramarital affair is discussed, but a lot of excuses are made on his part. On the other hand, his abolitionist sentiments have been massively played up, if there was all that much to start with. Doing so helps the traditional narrative of the time that the revolutionaries were idealists. Taken as simply a piece of entertainment, it's not a great look, but Hamilton has to be seen as more than that. Its presentation of history has led to a very real impact on the public understanding of history. So many articles and op-eds on Alexander Hamilton will obfuscate the fact that Hamilton was deeply involved with the slave trade, and was very quiet in any opposition to it that he may have had. Furthermore, one of his defining characteristics in the musical is the way he never backs down. He's presented as a man of unwavering ideals, when that couldn't be further from the truth. If we do seriously believe he opposed slavery, then that was one thing he never stuck to his ideals on. One interesting example of how easily he changed his tune on something brings us back to the election of 1800. In Chernow's biography, he explains that following Burr's electoral victory in New York, Hamilton tried to get the electoral system changed retroactively so that Burr would lose. As if that weren't insidious enough, a few months prior he'd opposed that same change. I suppose Hamilton didn't back down from his loathing of Burr. Were Hamilton just a fun musical playing around with history, this wouldn't be all that big. Just a simplification of a character. But Hamilton's importance to the cultural zeitgeist has gone far beyond that. What's more, Lin seems insistent that he is trying to take on history seriously, which only seeks to legitimize the false narratives of American history that the musical creates. Okay, I do want to admit here that the musical does have some interesting takes on how history is told, how the availability of sources biases our accounts, such as Eliza explicitly trying to condemn Hamilton by destroying the letters that may have redeemed him and denying historians access to her thoughts, or the way the narration is explicitly handed over to Hamilton for the Reynolds affair, explicitly giving him the right to tell the story and denying that same right to Maria Reynolds herself, although that does go kind of uncommented on. There's also the reoccurring motif of history has its eyes on you. This attempt to consider what it must be like to be involved in something you know history will remember, and that you will be judged within that. These ideas are genuinely interesting, if in need of more development to really bring them out to their fullest. However, the characters chosen to explore these ideas seem wrong, at least if you're going to consider them in such a heroised way. Hamilton as a character should have a lot more to contend with in his legacy than just, I cheated on my wife and annoyed a guy so much he shot me. Lin brings up his discomfort with the elitism of Hamilton and a lot of the other characters in the musical, but that concern never comes up in the text itself. Which brings me to a fundamental issue of the show, one that means no matter how great the music might be, no matter how touching the personal narratives, no matter how interesting the reflections on the writing of history, the musical is more harmful than beneficial to the public understanding of these people. Fundamentally, Lin thinks Hamilton is really cool. I don't think in and of itself thinking someone from the past is cool is a bad thing. Teddy Roosevelt once charged a gun emplacement on a horse. The horse was shot and killed, but he leapt off and kept running. Undeniably cool, if probably exaggerated by the newspaper that reported it. Even whilst I love to tell that story, I would never try to frame it as making him good. He was still a highly militaristic jingoist and colonialist who seemed to have an obsession with machismoism. At every turn, Lin tries to make Hamilton out to be this badass progressive hero because he seems highly invested in Hamilton as a person. The fact he cast himself as Hamilton very much gives away the fact he personally feels a connection to this figure. We might partly put this on Ron Chernow. He also gives off the sense that he thinks of Hamilton as cool, and that's the image that clearly embedded itself within Lin's mind. The problem is, if you're making a piece of media that you're trying to present as deeply historical, and talk that up in interviews about how researched it is, claiming you're telling this untold story forgotten to history, and then just repeating classic American foundational propaganda while centering someone who hated immigrants as an immigrant hero, it's just strange, maybe dishonest, not a good look, that's for sure. Part of the problem, I think, is the legitimization that Lin-Manuel Miranda being Puerto Rican gives him in telling an immigrant story. Not to bang on about Spivak every chance I get, but this kind of gets at why hearing the subaltern is more complex, because it has compounding factors. Lin might be an immigrant, but he's from a well-off family. His father was involved in New York politics. He is involved in politics as well, aiding in the continued imperial control over his home country by the United States. Lin is an immigrant, but to suggest that he speaks the voice of the working-class Puerto Ricans is a bit of a stretch, so the immigrant narrative he tells isn't the same as someone who came from poverty might wish to tell. In some ways, media that insists on adapting history to give messages that don't really seem to fit have always baffled me. Why try to make an arrogant elitist into a folk hero? Why not just make a story inspired by these characters but told in a way that doesn't have to be dishonest to make your point? Why not just tell the story as it was, with appropriate dramatic flair added of course, but without trying to portray it as telling us something it doesn't? I suppose saying based on a true story has long been a selling point. The use of history legitimizes a story, and always implies the message that you are placing in it is somehow more pertinent. Political groups will often look to the past to legitimize their beliefs in the most inane ways. An idea doesn't have to have been advocated for by someone 200 years ago for it to be good. You can just say, people in political power should be honest and not abuse their power, without making a whole musical about a guy who was happy to abuse his power for personal grudges. I don't really know how to bring this thing to a close. I don't know that I buy the idea that Hamilton is inherently bad and cannot be watched critically. Sometimes dramatizations of history can help spur new interest. Hearing a simple version of the past may make you interested to find the full story and see the nuances, but that won't be everyone. So is it then bad to use history and media full stop, because you might never achieve complete accuracy? Obviously not, but I think creators need to be more critical than they always are in how they're presenting the events of the past, if they're truly doing justice to the voices of all those who have a piece in the narrative. Having people of colour take on the role of the Founding Fathers is just dressing up the hegemonic power as the counterculture. Maybe the more revolutionary story to tell would be one of slaves, of poor immigrants, of Native Americans, trying to make the subalterns speak and spread their voices about such pivotal events in national histories. Stories like that are not ones that are likely to attract the mass appeal of Hamilton, though. Maybe the authentic voice must always be compromised to some degree to achieve commercial success, which is a condemnation of the system more than it is a dismissal of that criticism. It is good for history and entertainment to mix. Culture will always fuel other aspects of society and improve things, but caution must always be taken to make sure you don't simply replicate the harmful myths of old.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like and comment and subscribe and all that YouTubey stuff. Yeah, I don't have too much to reflect on this one. I normally like to do that, but yeah, it's kind of a sort of thinking aloud thing, almost like just getting my thoughts out about Hamilton. I mean, yeah, it's complex. I'm not sure how we can really move forward engaging with media in many circumstances, but yeah, I think as a general rule of thumb, avoid supporting Lin-Manuel Miranda these days. He is just a cultural front to a larger imperialist war on Puerto Rico. Yeah, if you enjoyed this, maybe check out some of the other videos I've done. They're of varying quality, I suppose, but aren't we all? And yeah, I've got plans for another video that I'm already working on. Also on a musical. I swear I'm not just a musical channel, but it's just these are the things that take my fancy, and yeah, whilst I've got that energy to do something, I always feel I should capitalize on it. So yeah, yeah, hope you enjoyed. Oh no, one last reflection actually. I do think it's very interesting in the interviews. It's kind of telling Lynn's given where he talks about people like Dick Cheney and the Clintons and Mitt Romney and people coming to see the musical and wishing to talk to them, and you know, the fact that all these people, varying political people, agree on Hamilton kind of shows that it doesn't do anything too drastic. Like, even its criticism of politicians is flawed by the fact that politicians go and watch it and then go, I wonder who that's for. It's basically just like that Garfield meme. That's my final thought on the musical. Yeah, so hope to see you around. Hope you have a nice day. I hope you're keeping safe in these times, and yeah. Working Boys, a new musical, is a better musical than Hamilton. Fight me, don't at me.